नमस्कार, म प्रकाश घिमिरे। कार्यक्रम रूपान्तरणमा तपाईलाई स्वागत छ। समष्टिगत विकाससँग जोडिएका विशिष्टीकृत विषयवस्तुमा विवेचना र छलफल गर्ने यो रूपान्तरण कार्यक्रममा आज हामी नेपाल र अस्ट्रेलिया बीचको 50 वर्षभन्दा लामो सम्बन्ध अनि अस्ट्रेलियाले नेपाललाई उपलब्ध गराउँदै आएको सहयोगको बारेमा कुराकानी गर्छौं। We all know that Australia is one of the attractive educational destinations for Nepali students. It demonstrates that Australia has the role model educational development in place. Australia has been providing technical and financial support to Nepal since 1960s. After establishing its embassy in 1984 here in Nepal, Australia has been increasing its technical and financial support to Nepal. During these 50 plus years of time, both countries have excellent bilateral relationship. In this context, today we are going to talk about Australian support to Nepal and the relationship of these countries. To talk about the issue, today we have invited Australian Ambassador to Nepal, Mr. Glenn White. Your Excellency, you are welcome in our program.
Thank you very much, Prakash.
Let's begin our conversation with your reflection working here in Nepal. You are working as Ambassador here in Nepal, and what is your reflection?
Well, my reflection is after 2 years, in fact it's more than 2 years, it's about 2.5 years now that I've been in Nepal. I've always been very impressed with the warmth of the communities that I've come across and met. I've always been impressed with the vistas of the scenic wonders of Nepal. And I think, like many Australians, I've come to love the place in terms of a place to visit, to travel through, and to get know better. My predecessor, Susan Grace, had been here 4 years. She visited something like 50 of the districts out of the 75. I haven't made it to 50 yet, and it's not a competition, but I do hope to come close to that 50 districts. I've been as far west as Darchula, I've been into the far east, I've been to Everest, at least Everest Base Camp, and I've been mostly along the Terai. So I've seen a little bit of the outskirts of Nepal. I hope in the next couple of years to get a better idea about the interior parts of Nepal.
Yeah, you are visiting lots of places and you are visiting with the diversified communities. What does it feel when meeting to these peoples?
Well, as I say, it's been a very warm experience for me as an ambassador for Australia or just an Australian citizen visiting communities here in Nepal. I don't think I've had a bad experience yet, which again would probably be repeated by others. It's an uplifting experience to see people with nothing wanting to give you everything they have virtually in terms of hospitality, in terms of a roof for the night, in terms of just talking about their lives. It's a great experience for someone like me from Australia. I might add this is my first time in South Asia as well. Most of my experience has been in the Pacific, South Pacific, as well as in the Middle East. And the people of Nepal as a region of South Asia are completely different from the sorts of areas that I've had experience in. Nonetheless, as I say, we have 28,000 Australians come visit Nepal each year. And I now understand why many of them come back time after time after time.
Now let's talk about Australian support to Nepal. Australia has been supporting Nepal since for more than 50 years. Could you please share the historical perspective of Australian support to Nepal?
I think the 50th anniversary was in 2010 of Australian support. And for the first, if you like, 40 years of that support, a lot of it was to do with reforestation. And one of my first messages when I first arrived here was that I met so many people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in fact, who said thank you very much for the forests that now exist in areas where they were just barren before. And I did have the opportunity in those first few months to visit several of those areas. More recently I visited other areas, but it was a very useful and necessary program that Australia engaged in for those first 30 or 40 years. It was a way of providing people in those communities with a future. That future, by and large, has now arrived. So those forests are now mature. They're ready to be used. And the next step, we've currently got a study that's looking at forest use of those community areas. And of course, the micro-enterprise development program, very many of the community-based enterprises use the forest, or at least use the dead wood and the shrubbery to make us things like charcoal burners, which is pretty amazing stuff coming from a country like Australia, which doesn't use charcoal anymore for those sort of purposes. More recently, we're involved with education. Mm-hmm. We're involved, as I say, with livelihoods through this micro-enterprise development program. We have in the past involved ourselves with health. We're involved with infrastructure projects through other partners. It's a fairly diverse portfolio that, and of course, more recently, we've been involved with humanitarian relief and now reconstruction.
Okay. And
we can talk about those sort of issues one at a time, if you like, but it's a fairly broad spectrum, albeit we're not the biggest kid on the block here. I mean, there are some other much larger programs than ours. What we do aim to do is provide the best bang for the buck, if you know that English term.
Yeah.
Basically, we're trying very hard to fill a niche where others aren't.
How does Australia prioritize the development support to the country like Nepal?
We work with the government of Nepal in many areas, asking them what they consider to be priorities. Mm-hmm. So between us, we come up with what those priorities and how we can meet them. For example, is the Ministry of Education. Another is through the MEDIP program, that is the Micro-Enterprise program, which is with UNDP as well as the Ministry for Industry, for example. We were involved with health. Health still has something like $4 million of Australian money to be able to be spent over the next 12 months. Mm-hmm. It's a partnership, and partnerships mean that we communicate. Partnerships mean that we bring something to the table, each of us, and we walk away with an agreement in terms of which way we will head with these sort of programs.
Yeah, Australia has been providing its support, both technical and financial support, to promote the various development activities and development issues here in Nepal. And what is your assessment regarding the outcomes of Australian support?
It's fair to say that Australian outcomes have been quite good. We've looked very closely at the sort of performance we're looking for in company with our partners, and we aim very hard to get to those objectives along the way. So in terms of the micro-enterprise program, for example, there's been over 70,000 micro-entrepreneurs produced. There's been
70,000.
70,000, 70,000.
In rural areas?
In rural areas, 60% of whom are women. Not only does those individuals get help, it's also the communities they live in through this multiplier effect. In other words, if an individual earns a little bit of money, he or she will probably spend it in the community he or she lives, which means someone else will get an income. So you have this cycle of wealth, or at least cycle of trade building, which is leading to people improving overall their standard of living in these sort of places.
Yeah, just to complement your statement, more than 70,000 grassroots levels peoples are being micro entrepreneur. Are they just getting engaged with the enterprise, or they are earning and they are supporting their livelihoods through their enterprise?
Well, I describe the Micro-Enterprise Development Program as a sort of mini Rotary, in that not only do people get some training on how to produce something, whatever it is, there's also a bit of market research goes into what sorts of occupations, what sorts of industries an area can support. So before they even begin, they've got an opportunity or viability to be successful. Then they get training in whatever it is that they wish to do, and then they get support through a peer group. In other words, each of the areas have sort of committees that they can go and talk to, they can get advice from, and basically contribute in terms of their own experience, their own innovation on how to do small business. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a businessman, but I do recognise that micro-enterprise or any enterprise
I'm
for that
just
matter,
asking
is
your
very
reflection,
hard.
Reflection.
It's a very hard task to make money running your own business. It's hard work. You've got to have ideas, you've got to have commitment, and you've got to have persistence. But the good news is the vast majority of that 70,000 and the 75,000 jobs that's also been created around them have been changing families, changing communities, and basically meaning that people in those communities have a much better life outcome.
What about the outcomes of educational support?
In education, the school sector reform program, which we're part of, has increased enrolment in basic education from 73% in 2009 to now it's a level of 86.3% for last year, 2014. That's clearly a 13% increase in terms of basic level enrolment. Gender parity has also increased, so there's more girls being involved in that sort of education process. We have directly supported an additional enrolment of approximately 50,000 students. 25,000 of those have been girls in the last 12 months. And we have delivered more than 300,000 textbooks through this process. By anybody's stretch of imagination, I think they're good outcomes. So we're happy with that sort of performance. Sure, we'd like to have perhaps delivered 600,000, but the fact is that we are having a positive impact. Our partners are having a constructive involvement, and the real winners of all this are the school students and the future citizens of Nepal.
Australian support has been invested in various development areas which you mentioned. What about the working modalities? How do you work? How do you mobilize the resources provided by Australian government?
We pick our partners very carefully. We also contribute to a pool system where it's Ministry of Education or whether it's whatever. So the ministries are a big part of that process in terms of a pool funding situation. So we find that our modest amount of money can actually multiply itself with others. So it becomes a larger investment fund that these ministries and other users can access. We also work very closely with the committees that run these sorts of things. We have close consultations. We basically say what we'd like to spend our money on. In our case in education, it's mainly aimed at primary schools, not secondary schools. Mm-hmm. So what we do is in the primary school sector. We've also assisted as a country with, I guess, earthquake proofing 169 schools. And I was very pleased to learn that following the two earthquakes, those 169 schools are standing intact. So they were safe. Unfortunately, many thousands of others weren't. But the schools that Australia had been involved with in terms of seismic reinforcing had come out of this in a good way. So much so that is part of our reconstruction commitment to Nepal. We're also involved with bringing over a couple of engineers who will work with the Ministry of Education to identify, design and help implement better quality schools as a Build Back Better sort of attempt.
After the devastating earthquake, Nepal has been facing lots of new development challenges. In this new context, how is Australia trying to support Nepal?
Australia had very early on provided $10 million Australian for humanitarian relief. That the first lots of that humanitarian relief arrived within a week. Mm-hmm. So that was things like shelter kits and food and health kits and different things. We had 2 C-17s fly in. We've also had some commercial aircraft come in during those first couple of weeks. That was the first thing. The second thing was that we committed to a reconstruction program, and that reconstruction program includes these 2 structural engineers that I just talked about. Yeah. It also includes support for around about 12,000 of these micro-entrepreneurs who have in fact lost their businesses in those earthquake-hit areas.
12,000.
About 12,000. So our intention is to restart them in business. Mm-hmm. Our intention is to find what businesses are now viable,
Which kind of support do they need?
what sort of support they need. So we'll ask them, what sort of support do you need? What sort of business do you want to get back into? If it's the same business, we'll find. They still have that entrepreneurial spirit, but they might have lost their tools, they might have lost their garden, they might have lost their plastic that they put over things. It's a way of re-establishing not just those individuals, but also the communities as viable community sort of places where people can live. If you don't have a job, it makes it very hard to rebuild your house. If you don't have a job, it's very hard to send your kids to school. But if we can provide those 12,000 people with a fresh start, not a new start, but a fresh start, that will be a great boon to the communities in those earthquake hit areas. It will inspire a certain degree of confidence, and also, of course, bring in a certain amount of money to those communities to enable them to re-establish.
Yeah. How that resources provided by Australian government will be mobilized or will go to the community, whether through the existing mechanism that is already developed to implement the MEDEP project, or you will mobilize the resources through other channels as well?
This will be basically an offshoot of the MEDEP project. So it's using the same expertise within the UNDP, it's using the same expertise within the Ministry of Industry, but it's got a different focus, that is a fresh start for people. We've also placed a new position. In other words, we've put an Australian official in to work with these areas directly. We haven't done that in the past. This time we have, and it's a way of us being able to galvanise things to go in the direction we wish. I have no doubt that UNDP and Ministry of Industry have just the right ideas we need. Our idea is to all work together to come up with an outcome that suits the people that need it most, that is these 12,000.
Australian government has its policy to minimize the aid and to increase the trade, if I am right.
Yep.
But in this context, Nepal need more and more aid in comparison to trade. It also needs trade, but it has no capacity to export its commodity to Australian market. In this context, will Nepal be deprived of getting sufficient Australian support in future, or it will be always benefited to get this kind of support?
Prakash, I have to say that always is a long time. None of us can sit here and say we'll always be doing this, that or the other. Government priorities, just like they do in Nepal, change from time to time. The Australian government is committed to an aid program that is quite global. But at the end of the day, we're talking about Australian taxpayer money. And partly that's driven by our own economic welfare, if you like. So when we have a situation like now where perhaps the Chinese economy is starting to sort of slow up, that will have an impact on Australia's economy because we supply a lot of raw materials to China for its manufacturing processes and its building processes. So in terms of economies, I can't sit here and guarantee you that Australia's commitment will remain. All I can say is we're a very good friend of Nepal. We've been your partner for over 50 years, and I can see no reason why that will cease anytime soon. Perhaps it will come to a close when Nepal becomes a non-least developed country, in other words, a developing country, or when it becomes a country that doesn't need Australian assistance anymore. At one stage, Australia was providing development cooperation funds to India. Now it doesn't, because India has reached that stage in its development where it no longer requires that sort of input. It's happened across the world in other places as well. It's a little bit like growing up, you know. Basically, you don't need your father or mother to sort of take you to the bus each morning. You can do it yourself after a while.
We talk about some development challenges created by the devastating earthquake. At the same time, another very important thing that now Nepal is moving on is that we are in process of constitution building. Political transition, new constitution building, aspirations of many peoples are also creating a kind of conflict. In this context, from development perspective, what are the new development challenges that you have felt here in Nepal?
Politics and policy are wrapped up with each other. It's difficult to extract one or the other, and basically if you have stability at a political level, you can also expect to have a certain degree of policy stability and therefore economic stability. And policy drives a lot of these things. If the policies chop and change, if the policies aren't there in the first place, if the policies are changed midstream...
Constitution is the preconditions of stable policy?
Well, I think Constitution is a very important symbol to the people of Nepal that things have changed. And I do know that political parties are working avidly towards a Constitution that will be promulgated soon. And I do hope that that takes place. The people of Nepal are owed a degree of political stability, and through political stability, economic development. That's really what everybody in the world wants. They want a stable place to live, they want to be able to look after their children, and they want a job that they can sort of provide for their families. Nepalis aren't any different, I'm sure, to all of that. That's what certainly we expect in Australia. And Nepal is on that path. And I've no doubt that the constitutional discussions that are going on even as we speak will eventually come to fruition, and the Constitution will be promulgated, enacted, and then perhaps there will be a degree of stability where government can start to re-engage with the sort of questions we're talking about, not just reconstruction following the earthquake, but also providing economic development, attracting investors, providing jobs for more people here in Nepal, so that they don't have to travel overseas and work and send money back. These are all policy considerations that flow from a stable political environment. And I've no doubt that Nepal is on that track.
What are the possibilities of further cooperation between Nepal and Australia, you see?
Well, there's always room for inspiration. We at the Embassy have a small amount of funding that we each year provide to different community groups. The window is closed at this stage, so it won't reopen again until May next year, but that's where a degree of flexibility has come into it. We've each year been trying to spend money in these niche sort of areas where a little amount of money can have a big impact on a community, on a NGO, on a group of professionals even. To date, the Embassy has been quite successful in that. In terms of the overall sort of government-to-government development assistance, I think we've got about the mix about right at the moment. That is livelihoods through the micro-enterprise program as well as education. We've chosen to stay with education. We've chosen to stay with micro-enterprise. In the future, who can say? We might say to ourselves, well, 100,000, 200,000 micro-entrepreneurs is great, but now we've gotten to the stage where a lot of those micro-entrepreneurs are now small business people. What can we do to assist small business rather than micro-enterprise or medium business? There could be all sorts of different things that we could come up with in the future. Nothing is ever written in stone.
Yeah. Is it possible?
Is what possible? That we will change, that we will have a different sort of mix. I think if you look at the programs over the last 20 years, certainly at one stage we're heavily involved with forestry. Now we're not so much. But that's not to say we wouldn't return to those sort of areas in terms of better ways to harvest those forests, or better ways to manage those forests, or different ways of managing those forests. And in terms of currently our interests in livelihoods and education, well, we may change. You never know. We might change from perhaps primary school education to vocational training one day. Whatever we and our development partners within the government feel is the best fit for the Australian and Nepali objectives.
Australia has very good experience of systematic development, and it has a different kind of development lessons as well. And since Australia and Nepal has very good relationship, how can Nepal adopt the development model of Australia?
Australia has grown in its economic stature over the last 150 years. Australia is only a very modern country. We only became a country in 1901. prior to that, we were a number of colonies, British colonies. And each of those colonies were, if you like, mini countries, all mostly perched around a coastline. So there were vast distances between each, and each little colony sort of had its own tax, its own defence force, its own governments, until 1901 when we said, hey, this is a bit silly. We're sitting here in this huge continent. We need to form a country that can govern the entire country, not just a piece of it. So we went down a federal path. That federal path has been very successful for us. The states and the Commonwealth, or the centre of the government, shares responsibilities to the people of the country and also in terms of taxation and things of that nature. For us, it's worked well. We are blessed in Australia with quite a large amount of natural resource in terms of not just minerals but also gas, oil. Those sorts of things sort of come with the territory, if you like. Nepal, unfortunately, isn't necessarily blessed with the things we are, but it does have a driving enterprise here. And it also has some niches where it can make a living from, things like hydropower, things like tourism. These sort of areas are very close to, I think, will be the answers to Nepal's future. So many people can be involved in tourism. So much industry can actually come from hydropower. And these are two areas I think that can basically be used by Nepal. Not to necessarily follow Australia's model, because Australia's model is unique, as is Nepal's future. Each country has to find its own path, but it just needs people that can think about it. Just recently I met with a group of people in the information technology area who wanted to make Nepal a kind of back office to Europe and Australia, as much the same way that has happened in India. No reason why it couldn't, as long as the communication systems stay developing as they are. It's becoming an area that Nepal needs to broaden its outlook, perhaps. But in terms of following its own path, it won't be Australia's path.
Excellency, last but not the least, do you have any message to our audience who are watching your interview?
We have been with you through thick and thin, and we intend to be with you into the future. So I am looking forward to more Australians coming to visit. I'm looking forward to those Australians getting to meet more Nepali people, falling in love with the country, and coming back not just to visit, but also to bring back expertise and a degree of wealth so that people can make a living out of it.
Thank you very much for your time and insightful interview.
Thank you, Prakash.
हस्त दर्शकवृन्द यही कुराकानीका साथ आजको रूपान्तरण कार्यक्रम यहीँ टुङ्ग्याउँछौँ। नेपालका लागि अस्ट्रेलियाका राजदूत ग्लेन व्हाइटसँग गरिएको यही कुराकानीका साथ आजको रूपान्तरण कार्यक्रम यहीँ टुङ्गिन्छ। अर्को हप्ता फेरि तपाईँ हाम्रो भेटघाट हुन्छ। आजलाई बिदा दिनुहोस्। नमस्कार।